Hi everyone, Carl Steele here for Brooklyn College, English 3111, Fall 2022, Medieval English Literature, talking about the Scottish poet Robert Henryson. So Robert Henryson was a schoolmaster, we believe, in a town called Dunfermline. So here is Edinburgh in Scotland. You see it on this map. Dunfermline is across the water over here, now a small town, but at the time quite important, a place where the kings visited. Here's a bit of the ruins that are in the town now, but you can still, of course, have a drink and hang out in the town. As a poet, we've got about 5,000 lines of poetry by him, including a response to Chaucer's Troilus Cresside called the Testament of Cressid, which imagines what happens to Cressida after she betrays Troilus. She gets leprosy. And also a version of the Orpheus myth, which is much more straightforward than the Middle English Sir Orfeo. And he also has this large collection of Aesop's fables. We're reading one of them, The Preaching of the Swallow. This Preaching of the Swallow dates back a very long ways to a collection of Greek stories known as Aesop's Fables, which, like other fables, typically feature talking animals. And here is how the story goes in one of the early versions. I'm reading from Laura Gibbs' translation of Aesop. Some birds who had flocked together saw a man sowing flaxseed, but they thought nothing of it. The swallow, however, understood what this meant. She called an assembly of the birds and explained that this was an altogether dangerous situation. But the other birds just laughed at her. When the flaxseed sprouted, the swallow warned the birds again. This is something dangerous. Let's go and pull it up. If it is allowed to grow, people will make it into nets, and we will not be able to escape the traps that they devise. The birds mocked the swallow's words and scorned her advice. So the swallow went to the people and began to make her nest only under the roofs of their houses. Meanwhile, the other birds refused to heed the swallow's warnings, so now they are constantly being trapped in nets and snares. This story is told throughout the Middle Ages. I have an illustration here from a late 15th century manuscript, which is a French translation of a German translation of Aesop by a man named Steinhovel. And we also have an English translation of that by Caxton, and this is the French translation by Julien Machaut. And you see the illustration has the swallow over here preaching to the foolish birds, and here is the farmer going through and planting flaxseed. It's a very straightforward illustration. Here is a version in 12th century French, which is ascribed to Marie de France, that is, the person whose Les Lanval you read, and this here tells the story. If you'd like, you can pause the video and read this, and you also get the moral, and I'll talk a bit more about morals on the next slide. I do want to call attention to one thing here, though. When the swallow had heard how they had denounced her, she got together with a group of her relatives, including the best of her lineage, and made peace with the farmer. He let her make her nest in his house, and there were her nestlings raised. She left his flax alone. Never would he lose it because of any swallows. So this, in her version, becomes indubitably a story about the swallow feeling that it can't do anything more for birds and throwing in its lot with humans. It's a story about politics, political loyalty, treachery, and frustration, and who is going to come out on top. This is often a feature of these fables that we have transmitted under the name of Marie. What happens with the swallow and how she relates to humans is going to vary quite significantly across the various versions of this story. It's something worth studying further. So to say a bit more about fables as a genre, they are typically short works. They are often stories of talking animals. They are typically used to teach children. Children learn how to read first by reading proverbs, short morals, and they eventually make their way up to reading fables. And they are often given the instruction to take a fable and make it short, to compress it into a sentence or two, or to take a sentence or two of a story and to make it as long as possible. So if Robert Henryson is a schoolmaster in Dunfermline, you can understand then why he's so interested in writing fables and why his fables are so elaborate and full of Latin vocabulary. It's because he's a schoolmaster and he's demonstrating to his students what you can do with fables. So fables also tend to travel with what's called a promethium or an epimythium. This is the moral of the fable. It's the interpretation of it that gives it some kind of lesson. So it's a promethium if it comes before the fable. It's an epimythium if it comes after the fable. Robert Henryson's version of the story is extremely long. You saw on the previous slide that Maria de France's version fits onto a single slide. It's probably only 30 or so lines of poetry. Robert Henryson's is 47 stanzas. Each one of those stanzas is 7 lines. It's extremely long. It's unusually long. He divides it into 4 parts. There is a long prologue, which is about God's power and human ignorance. It goes for 8 stanzas. There's 5 stanzas that are about the various seasons, the course of the year, which is going to become important in the narrative of this fable. There's the fable itself, the narrative, which is 25 stanzas. And then there's the epimythium, that is what he calls the morality, which is 9 stanzas, which interprets this in a Christian framework, which is really not unusual. What I have here is the earliest surviving version of the Fables of Robert Henryson. This is from Thomas Bassendean's printing in Edinburgh, 1571. So probably almost 90 years after Henryson has died. This is the earliest version we have. It's print, it's not manuscript, that is, it's not done by hand. And this is Aesop here on the front, and little bits representing various parts of his fables all throughout this. And then you can read through this and see who printed it and who it's ascribed to. And now to talk about the language. So this is Middle Scots, which is the language that's used in the Scottish lowlands, so Dunfermline, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Stirling, from roughly 1450 to roughly 1700, after which it transitions into modern Scots. I'm going to try to read it, but my Scottish accent is not so good, so maybe you can find a better recording elsewhere. The he prudence and working marvelous, the profound wit of God omnipotent, is so perfect and so ingenious, excellent for all man's argument, for we to him all thing is aye present, richt as it is, or any time shall be, before the sight of his divinity. Therefore our soul, with sensuality so federatis in present corporal, we may not clearly understand nor say, good as he is, a thing celestial, or murk and deadly corpse material, blind is the spiritual aberration, leak is in man, rebunden in prison. So to call attention to the poetry, this is each stanza is straightforwardly A, B, A, B, B, C, C. He keeps it up throughout. You will notice that the language is highly elevated. It's full of what is called very aureate language, A-U-R-E-A-T-E. Golden is the root of that. It means a language that has a lot of words drawn directly from Latin. And we can also see too that it has a very strong Scottish accent. Saw for so, far for, oni for any, soul for soul. Basically, you can see that the A and the O are often swapped from what you'd expect. Again, there is no standard spelling. The spelling is a close reflection of how it is that people were speaking, whether the poet themselves or their scribe. And so this tells us that this is Scottish poetry, even if we didn't know that Robert Henryson was Scottish, because the poetry is written with a Scottish accent. Part of the feature of this aureate language is the fact that the nouns and adjectives, the noun often comes first and the adjective often comes second. This is the case in French, often the case in Latin. These are more elevated languages. They have a higher status, and Henryson is imitating that because he's writing high status poetry, I think, to impress his students, or maybe to impress the King of Scotland. So you have working marvelous, corpse material. And the larger question is this. This is a strange way to begin an animal fable. He begins by a discussion of the inferiority of human epistemology, that is, human ways of knowing, in relation to God's perfect intellect. You can ask yourself, why does a poem begin this way? What does this have to do with a poem that's about birds and other birds not listening to the warning So ask yourself that, and we can talk about that in class. And now I'm going to read you a bit of a translation of the first two stanzas. This is from the book I have pictured down here by Seamus Heaney, the great Nobel laureate poet who translated Beowulf and also translated Henryson and did a lot of other things. Here's how he does it. God's great wisdom and his marvelous workings, the deep insight of the omnipotent, are in themselves so perfect and discerning. They far excel our merely human judgment, all things for him being ever present, as they are now, and at all times shall be, in the full sight of his divinity. That is, by the way, that's Boethius, book 5 of the Constellation of Philosophy. That's more or less where he's getting that. Next stanza. Because our soul, imprisoned in the body, is bound and fettered by the sensual, we may not clearly understand or see God as he is, or things celestial. Our murky, gross, death-bound material blindfolds the operations of the spirit, like a prisoner shut in darkness and chained up. In this version of the fable, Henryson does something that no other version of the fable that I know of does, which is that he writes the witness to the events into the poem itself. So it's not just simply you reading about the swallow failing to warn the other birds, but rather you're watching the poet, as it were, witness this event, and you're watching his frustration or his agony as he watches the swallow be unable to convince the birds. So he imagines himself walking through the fields, hiding under a hedge, watching the swallow, watching the birds not listen to him, comes back again. A year later, the swallow comes back, the birds still don't listen, and then he watches as all the little birds foolishly end up dead, quite pathetically, and there's nothing he can do about it. Why did he put himself into the poem like that? So we can talk about that in class. And here's more or less how the poem goes. Their small birdes, for hunger famished near, full busy scraping for to sake their food, the counsel of the swallow would not hear, suppose their labour did them little good. When show their foolish hertes understood, so under it, up into entree she flew. With that, this churl over them his nettest threw. Alas, it riecht great herte ser to say, that bloody butcher bait these birdes doon, and for till here, when they wist well today, their careful song and lamentation. Some with an staff he strake to earth on swoon, some off the head, of some he broke the crag, some half on nieve he stopped in his bag. And this is Seamus Heaney's translation. These little birds, half dead from hunger now, and foraging for dear life for their food, paid no heed to the preaching of the swallow, although their grubbing did them little good. That was the moment when she understood their foolish hearts and minds were obdurate, and as she fled, the fowler drew his net. Alas, it was heartbreaking then to see him butcher those little songbirds out of hand, and hear, when they understood their hour had come, how grievously they sang their last and mourned. Some he hit with his stick and left there stunned, some he beheaded, on some he broke the neck, some he just stuffed alive into his sack. How dreadful. So again, about the poetry, the language itself, full busy, full as in other Middle English is used is a synonym for very. It's an intensifier. Riecht is used the same way. Alas, it riecht great herte ser to say. Riecht is being used to mean very, very great sore heart to see, a great pain in my heart to see. He's suffering by watching this. And then we have some very particularly Scottish words, or accents, I should say. Seek for seek, there for there, food for food, wild for wood. And here is done as here, here. So we also have adjective plus adverb as a common feature. Famished near, near famished, almost starved is what that means. And careful is a word that's used. Careful song. Careful here means not taking care, but rather sorrowful, full of sorrow, full of care. That's what that means. So they are, of course, know as they're trapped in a net, They know they're going to die, and they're singing out one last time before they get beheaded and their skulls crushed, or they're stuffed alive into a bag to be taken off and maybe turned into food. And we can ask the question, what does that alas do at the beginning of that stanza? Alas, it richt herte ser to say. Whose alas is that? Who is he speaking to? Who's feeling that? Especially because this is a poem about the foolishness of these birds that won't listen. It's a fable. It's classically a moral lesson where you are supposed to make moral judgments. And how does that alas function in relation to that? What are you supposed to feel? And some final words now about the peculiar context of the early versions of Henryson's fables. So we have the 1571 printing, as I've already said. Then we have British Library Harley manuscript 3865, which is a manuscript which we know is copied after 1571, so quite late into the 16th century probably, because it's actually a handwritten copy of a printed book. So typically chronologically, we tend to think of manuscript coming first and then books coming after and books replacing manuscripts. But in fact, manuscripts continue to be produced well into the print era, and there's even some people still doing them now, although not in any great numbers. So for whatever reason, we have one version of this surviving in a print version, and then there's a unique manuscript copy, which is a rather strange handwritten copy of the printed book. And here is the illustration for the Preaching of the Swallow. Very neatly copied up there is the title of the work, Preaching of the Swallow. Then we have this tree with the birds in it. We have this hand holding a dead bird in it. We have a pulpit with someone preaching up here, or perhaps telling a story. There's a hedge, and there's someone hiding under the hedge. So we have all the kind of key features of this. Even that cross-hatching might be the flax that's been planted. And you can see from the title page over here that parts of this are basically just traced or copied over from there. So that hand ends up here, the pulpit ends up here, the person who's up here is arguably that preacher or possibly Aesop, and this head down here might be this head down here, which is Aesop when he's been thrown off a cliff, and that's how Aesop dies in most versions of the story. So if you want to read more about what's happening in that, you can read a very interesting article by Alex Mueller, who's a professor in Massachusetts, Stealing a Corpus, Appropriating Aesop's Body in the Early Era of Print, from the journal Digital Humanities Quarterly from 2018. The print version is printed in 2 typescripts. One of these, I think, will be very difficult for you to read, and this is the very opening of the poem and that difficult typescript. So this is the same as over here, handwritten, of course, copy of that. And I've already read those stanzas to you. It's the very opening of the poem. This particular typescript or typeface is known as civilité. It's invented in the 16th century by a French printer named Robert Grandjon, Granjon, which was meant to be used in books for children. It's so called the civilité because it was often used to print a book by Erasmus called La Civilité Pérille on the education or the civilizing of children. And so it's a typescript that's meant to imitate handwriting because it was thought in early educational theory that children should learn how to read first from something not that resembled handwriting, something that was closer organically to this kind of script that they were expected to produce. So that's kind of interesting in the history of education. But in the 1571 print version, there's another typeface, this Roman typeface, which is used for the table of contents and used for the morals. It's much, much easier to read. And it's interesting to me that it's associated, I would think, with the more adult or controlling or educational content of this. So the civilité is used for the narrative, and the Roman typeface is used for the bit where it's moralized, or in the apparatus where you can help you find a story. And maybe we can talk about that in class a bit too, and I'll read this stanza to you to give you a sense of what this sounds like. Lo worthy folk, Aesop, the noble clerk, and poet worthy to be laureate, when did he waked from more authentic work, with other mo, his forced fable right, Whilk this time may well be appliqué de guide moral edification, hastened in sentence, according to raison. Lo, worthy people, in Seamus Heaney's translation, that noble scholar Aesop, a poet worthy to be a laureate, when he relaxed from more exacting work, wrote this fable and other fables like it, which at this moment serve to educate and edify, because they have a meaning that furthers good and accords with reason. And so we can talk about this apology for fables, this attempt to justify them by saying that they do some good. What is the relationship between the moral and the pleasure that we experienced in reading this, or even that kind of sense of dismal desperation that we might have felt as we were watching the birds get killed? So that's something to wonder about as well. One last thing is that this manuscript copy, well, it did a very good job at imitating the civilite typeface, but whoever was doing this didn't really seem to understand the relationship between the civilite typeface and the Roman typeface. So the manuscript copy more or less just uses the same script all the way through it. That's too bad. The scribe should have done a better job, and I will see you on Monday.